Today on my match fishing memories, I want to talk about going to the River Witham in Lincolnshire. It was a water that I never thought I'd fish. I'd certainly read plenty about it over the years. There had been a national there in 1973, and the Witham seemed to be mainly about bream fishing. Occasionally you'd see stuff about catching roach on there, and that was about it. It was a place where there were very big matches, and if you weren't drawn on bream it seemed to be quite hard. In the last match fishing memories I talked about my very first national on the Trent, where Barclays had come about midway out of 90 teams, so they hadn't got relegated, and the following year the venue was the Division 3 on the Witham in 1978. One of the anglers who was involved with the squad the second year was a guy called Tony Finch, who lived in Leicester, and he had a mate who knew Howard Humphrey, who was one of the famous Leicester Likely lads, which was Ivan Mark's team. Really top angler, and someone I'm still in touch with very regularly nowadays. And Tony had arranged for Howard, through this mutual friend, for Howard to help us on the Witham. And once again we had pretty much the same team as the year before. I don't think it was exactly the same. And Neil and myself went up on the Friday to stay with Tony for a weekend before the national. So this was a few weeks before the national, and this time we were actually going to have a team practice. We were all going to be there with some coaching from Howard and see what we could make of it. And that was on the Saturday, and on the Sunday we would fish a big open match on the Witham, which was the Lincolnshire Championship. This was around about the end of July. I can't remember exactly when the match was, probably about the third week of August. Having met up with Tony in the evening, he then said, right, we're meeting Howard at Leicester railway station at around about 10 o'clock, and we're picking up a load of Bloodworm and Joker that's coming down. I don't know if it came from Billy Sharples in Wigan or someone in Leeds, one of those. There were a few outfits that were supplying Bloodworm and Joker back in the 70s for matches like this, and a very nice little trade it was in selling packets of peat. There was Bloodworm and Joker in there, but for me, I'd read about Bloodworm and Joker. I'd never fished with it, and I didn't really know what this meant. Anyway, we picked up the bait, said hello to Howard, went for a quick drink somewhere in a pub, and the next day we all set off for Lincolnshire. Went off to, I'm trying to think where we went. I think we went down to Tattersall Bridge down that area, and downstream of there, I think it's called Chapel Hill, to practice. And Howard said to us what we needed to do, what we needed to practice, was to fish with Bloodworm and Joker on about 3 metres out, 2.5, 3 metres out. Now in those days we all had poles, and but they were only 5 or 6 metres. They were all fiberglass poles. I had a Shakespeare International pole, which is 5.4 metres, which is about 18 foot. And this had 3 tips. One was a very soft flick tip. There was a sort of standard tip, which was a bendy, hollow fiberglass tip. And then there was a tip that it was shortened, but then it had a alloy pole crook that pushed onto the shortened tip, and you could put a hook on some pole elastic onto that. There was no internal elastic, that hadn't been invented yet. People were thinking about pole crooks that were hollow, but basically you put some elastic on the end of the crook, and each rig you made up would have its own elastic to go with that rig. Seems incredible now to say, but and that elastic would have been very fine. What we were fishing for were Ruffe, Tommy Ruffe, Daddy Ruffe, call them what you like. And the Witham, when it was still and in the middle of the summer, fishing amongst the weeds close in, was absolutely lousy with these Ruffe. And the basic idea was to feed some jokers in Leam and fish a bloodworm on a little hook, a 22 hook, fine wire, close in, and whip out these rough, which were very small. I mean, they were less than half an ounce each, probably more like a third of an ounce each. Very lucky to get one as big as an ounce. Some of them were tiny because they're bristly little things, they're spiky. And that was the tactic, and the idea was to catch 1.5 pounds of these rough, everyone to catch that, maybe pick up 1 or 2 little roach. And it's funny that about 12 years later, when I fished a Division 1 national on there, the team that won it actually won using bloodworm and joker, but on different tactics, and they caught lots and lots of roach and little silver bream and stuff like that, little hybrids and skimmers. But at that time in 78, there weren't many of those roach around. It was basically these rough. And then once you've caught as many rough as you could and the swimmer died, you'd probably got 3 hours of the match left, and you'd do something else. You'd try something else, whether that was fishing a waggler or whatever with maggots or gozzers. And so we sat down to do this, and I looked at the Witham, and there were fish topping, and there was it was very, very slow flow, hardly moving at all. And I said to Howard, I really fancy fishing this on a waggler. And he said, well, I really want you to practice fishing with bloodworm. But I said, I've got to get this out of my head to fish with a waggler. He said, okay, do me a deal. Have an hour on the waggler, but then promise me you will fish hard for a couple of hours with the bloodworm and joker on the pole, and you'll have a look at what other people are doing. I said, okay. So I set up my pole rig already, but then I went and fished a waggler, and the waggler that I used was the sort of waggler that I was using on the Froome, with a black tip like this, which is 5BB with an insert, thin peacock insert, sort of 5BB lock-in and 4 or 5 number 8s down the line. And I threw this waggler out in this, like I said, it looked like it was barely moving, and the float wouldn't behave properly at all. It sort of skewed weirdly and dragged, and instead of just sitting there and barely moving through, it just wouldn't behave. And I said to Howard, I said, what the hell's going on here? I wasn't getting any bites, and it just wasn't working. He said, oh, what's happening is down at Boston, which is a few miles downriver, there are great big sea gates, and the sea gates, they're drawing off some water, and what's happening is underneath it's sort of moving, or I think what it was is the top was moving very slowly, but underneath that it was still, and my float was getting dragged sort of sideways, so that the top bit was dragging it over, and it just wasn't doing anything. He said, what you need are floats more like these things, which are quite a bit longer, and these are ones that I made as a result of that conversation, and these are taking 3.5 to 4 swan. Still got sensitive tips, but they've all got a body at the bottom, right at the very base, peacock quill with the thin peacock antennas. And he said that will sit down in that water that's still, and then the top bit, it will sit at the corrects, and it won't get skewed along and pulled out of position. So he said, when it comes to the waggler fishing, you're going to need some floats like these. They were floats from his tackle box. He had his gear there. And so I fished my hour badly with a waggler. Didn't catch much. Well, didn't catch anything at all on that. And then he said, right, you've promised me you're going to fish with the bloodworm and joker. So I sat down and fished with bloodworm and joker, and I had around about 50 of these little rough of just about a pound, I suppose. I think we had a little weigh in, and everyone caught between about 12 ounces and 1.5 pounds. Some people did better than others, and it was clear that some of our anglers had a lot more pole experience. People like Neil Crozier, who goes on Maggot Drowners, he was fishing places like the Lee, living in East London, and pole fishing had really taken off the previous few years. So he was several years ahead of people like me who had just been dabbling with it, really hadn't found the right sort of opportunities with a pole. Was using a pole, but not really getting the best out of it. And it was clear with the sort of floats we used then were very, very sensitive compared to the ones that we get now. They had wire antennas, which were very, very thin, far thinner than the ones people use with sort of pellets and things on commercials. Anyway, we had the basis of this tactic, and we all agreed it seemed to work. We caught, like I say, mostly about a pound or so. We agreed we needed to be able to do something else for sort of 3 hours in a match, and to pick up a few roach and skimmers, maybe fishing out in the middle, maybe eels. No one really talked about bream fishing. There was no emphasis on that at all. And the following day we then went and fished the Lincolnshire Championship, and it was I seem to remember, quite a grotty day, grey. It may have even rained a little bit. And although we were fishing this big open, we decided we would try it. We had enough bloodworm and joker to try it out under match conditions. And I did that the following day, and I had about 80 rough. And then, like I said, died after about 2 hours. And I went out on a waggler and I caught 4 or 5 little roach and rudd, skimmers, all little stuff. But I ended up with nearly £2, and the Witham was pretty hard in those days. If we all caught nearly £2 in the actual national, we'd get promoted. There was no doubt about that. That was good enough. And I can't remember what other people caught. I do remember the journey home. Neil had a Saab 99, I think it was. And we were travelling back from that Sunday night, right at the end of July. Roads were very busy. And we'd come off one of the, probably the M1 or something, travelling between Towcester and Oxford, sort of Brackley and Oxford there. And I said to Neil, turn the radio off. I didn't own a car then, but I said there's a sort of boom, boom, boom. And I think it's coming from the engine. So I turned the radio off, and we pulled into a lay-by, and the engine was making the wrong noise. There was a boom, 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 boom that went up and down according to the throttle speed. And we cut the engine out. Neil was in the AA, and he called out the AA, and the guy said the same, start the engine up. When he listened to it, he said, no, you're going nowhere. You're going to need AA relay. And we were relayed with the car on the back of the truck to Southampton, and then back to Neil's place in Bournemouth. And by then it was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and eventually I got home, and I think I had to take the day off work because I've been up all night, one thing and another, day off holiday, which was a bit of a blow, but there you go. And his engine needed a rebuild. Anyway, 3 weeks later, Neil's car's been rebuilt. Off we went for the national, and this time we went up quite early on the Friday morning, and the national rules were such that anyone in the match could not fish the venue the week before, from the Sunday night, the week before the national, which would be on a Saturday. The venue was closed to competitors. We were greeted with Howard, and he said, I think we need to look at our tactics. Something's happened. He said, what we're going to do, we're going to go down the wrong bank of the Witham, not the side that's fished. We can get access down the old railway track on the other bank of the Witham, and we'll find a quiet peg there where no one can watch us, and I'll just I'm going to fish. He could fish, whereas we couldn't, and I'll talk tactics with you when we get there. And what had happened was that there was a local team involved in the national. It may well have been, I don't know if it was Boston or a similar team, and they had spoken to the people who controlled the sluices down at Boston, and they said, can you build the water up, and then the day before the national and into the national, can you run it off because of the way the tides are? Can you build that water high and then run it off? And what that will do is, with the river flowing, and we're talking a pretty gentle flow, but it's a gentle flow, the bream will feed. They weren't interested in catching rough. They wanted to do well individually. If the river was stood dead still, the bream wouldn't really feed. There would be a few here and there, but they wouldn't really feed. But with a running river, the bream would feed. They, like I say, they weren't bothered with scratching. They were just going to fish for bream, 12 of them, but they wanted that river to do what they wanted it to do. And if that meant slipping 10 or 20 quid to the guy who controlled the sluices, so be it, because they were going to win more than that, and they did. The problem with that was that the rough would only feed well when the river was pretty much static. And we'd ordered our Bloodworm and Joker, we'd got it all, and there was enough for Howard to have a little dabble with it. And he said, I'm going to show you, look, it's moving out there. And he went in on the pole, and he barely raised a bite. He might have caught 2 or 3 rough, not very much at all. He said, I think what you've got to do is to mix a little bit of ground bait up, put some of this Bloodworm and Joker in there, and go out into the middle and just drag it through with one of these big floats, which he had said to everyone, make sure you're properly equipped with the proper floats. He made that clear. And catch what you can. It might be eels, it might be roach, it might be skimmers. You might pick up the odd rudd. But while you should try that Bloodworm and Joker approach close in, because it might work for somebody, it's not really going to be a viable tactic this time. In a word, we were sunk. We didn't really have a plan B. We had a plan A that I think it was admitted that other teams had picked up on this Bloodworm and Joker approach, and they were also sunk. And it was basically going to be a hard match, because it was going to be bream or bust. And that's what happened the following day. I drew a peg, I don't know where I was, 200 or 300 pegs below Kirkstead Bridge, I expect, with a very high bank behind me. I think I was allowed to stand in the water. The rules on wading in nationals has chopped and changed over the years. Sometimes you could do it, sometimes you couldn't. You usually had to be able to touch the bank, but this bank was right up high behind me. I managed to get down into the water, just stood right there, and with one of these big bodied antennas with sort of 3.5 swan round a thing, float set to 14 foot deep with a 22 on it, and sort of 4 or 5 number 8s down the line. You could just flick this great big float off the top of the rod tip, and it would pick up that line that was in the water and just hurl it all out into the middle. And that's what I did for 5 hours. I just pushed it out there and picked up a mixture of eels and odd roach and skimmers and things for just over £1. Whoopee-doo. Not very good. We really struggled. This second year there were less teams than the first year. First year there'd been 90 teams in the Division 3. This time there was like 73. Whether they'd set up Division 4 by then, I think that's possible. And we came well down at 50 something, and my £1.25 was second best weight in the team. I had about 50 points, so not a particularly good result. And generally the team struggled for a few ounces. I think the best weight in the team was only £1.10, which was Neil Crozier, who did a bit better than the rest of us. I think he may have persevered on the pole, and I think eventually you could get fish on the pole, maybe on the long pole with bloodworm. So the Witham was a hard taskmaster that year. In one or two later years I did a bit better, but that's a story for another day. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you again soon.